Welcome to Chapter 8.4, U.S. History. This is the new nation, Federalists and Jeffersonian Republicans. Well, the Founding Fathers never anticipated or desired what later became known as political parties, but at the time was called partisanship. By the election of 1800, this system of political parties was very firmly entrenched. Jay's Treaty was the first incident that started to divide the political parties or create the situation that became very divisive in the government, early government. And Jay's Treaty was a thing that kind of resolved an issue between America and the British Navy. The British Navy had begun to seize American ships that were bound for France from the West Indies. They had captured about 250 vessels and confiscated all their cargoes of sugar. And in order to avoid war, President Washington had sent John Jay on a special envoy to Britain to try to seek compensation for all the seized cargo and the seized ships. Eventually, the settlement became known as Jay's Treaty because John Jay returned with a comprehensive but controversial agreement between the United States and Great Britain. It agreed to full and complete compensation to all the British merchants for pre-Revolutionary War debts that were owed by American citizens. So this meant that Americans had to pay British debtors back for things that had been given before the war, and the treaty also acknowledged British right to remove French property from American-owned ships. So this meant that the British felt like they had the right to search and seize anything that they felt was French, because the British and the French were at war at this moment, this point in time. It also required, but on the other side, it required the British to end their aid to Western Indians in opposition to American settlers, and that they must remove all their military garrisons from American territories west of the Appalachian Mountains. This treaty was very controversial, and different parts of the American public agreed or disagreed with different aspects of the treaty. And so it began a division within the American population. The different interest groups began to be divided between commercial versus agrarian interests, and Atlantic seaboard states versus the frontier states, and also those who supported the British, called Anglophiles, versus those who supported the French, or Francophiles. These were nothing, though, compared to the really big division between the northern and the southern states. But this division was often very conscientiously avoided, and and the different parties tried to smooth over any differences between the North and the South because of the great powder keg that would be, because the main issue there was between slave-owning states and non-slave-owning states. The two parties that emerged became known as the Federalists and the Jeffersonian Republicans. So the Federalists were pro-British and desired larger, stronger government. And the Jeffersonian Democrats were more pro-France and desired less government that was more directly controlled by the people. The election of 1796, which pitted John Adams against Thomas Jefferson, brought John Adams into the presidency, but it made Thomas Jefferson the vice president simply because he was the runner-up in the election. And this style of choosing the vice president eventually went out of fashion because they were not able to work together because they were from different sides of the political ideas of the time. So even though Adams was victorious in the election, he suffered a lot of opposition from the opposite party, which were the Jeffersonian Democrats. Adams tried to conduct his presidency in almost exactly the same way that George Washington had, and he found it quite difficult. First of all, because he did not command the same type of respect that George Washington had. Adams kept the same cabinet members that the president had appointed, and Alexander Hamilton, who had been the Secretary of Treasury, had retired the year before, but all the cabinet members still kept on going back to Alexander Hamilton for advice about financial things, and so this somewhat undercut Adams's authority because it went around his leadership. There was also the problems with the Jay Treaty and the tensions between the United States and France, and these made his presidency extremely difficult for him. Hoping to resolve the conflict between the United States and France, he sent a representative to France, but the French foreign agent wouldn't even meet with the Americans until they promised to pay a bribe to the French government. This, when this was communicated back to the legislative branch in Washington, it was a shocking thing, and it made the Americans extremely angry with the French. And this affair became known as the XYZ affair because John Adams had censored the document so that the names of the people who went as representatives of the United States were blocked out with XYZ. And so this became known as the XYZ affair. The phrase, "millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute," was shouted out throughout this time period as an example of how of the support for Adams's presidency, because this event really helped to bolster his leadership and his respect among the American people. They began building up their army, and they even called Washington out of his retirement, and they tripled the size of the military forces. And this became known as the quasi-war, because they never actually went to war against France, but they armed themselves as if they were going into war. Adams did make some very serious breaches in judgment during his presidency, though. And one of the biggest ones was something called the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Alien Act was focused on trying to increase the amount of time that someone needed to spend in the country before they would be considered a naturalized citizen. So they increased the residency requirement for citizenship from 5 years to 14 years. So the Alien Act authorized the president to deport any foreigner or immigrant that he felt was dangerous to the peace and the safety of the United States. In the Sedition Act, it prohibited any publisher or news editor from publishing any malicious articles against the president or his government. So this, using legal powers to try to suppress any political disagreement, was seen by the opposition as truly evil and very dictatorial, and it was greatly resented. The Jeffersonian Republicans shouted out that this violated the First Amendment, which gave people the freedom of speech and press, and the act was probably unconstitutional. But the Republicans didn't turn to the federal courts to try to solve the problem because the authority in the federal courts was very Federalist, and it would have supported John Adams and his administration rather than the Jeffersonian Republicans. The debate over the Alien and Sedition Acts was right before the 1800 election, so it set the stage for the 1800 election. Well, Jefferson and the Jeffersonian Democrats won the 1800 election, even though Adams had pushed forward a conclusion to the hostilities between France and the United States and had tried to do his best for the country. They didn't see that as being as important as Thomas Jefferson's support for the First Amendment and the support of freedom of speech and press. John Adams actually went against his party in that regard because the Federalists were very much desiring to go to war, and so they felt like Adams had sold them out in regards to allowing the United States to go to war for this. But they also did not respect him for another reason, and that was because under his leadership, Congress had enacted a direct tax on houses and on whiskey. And these two were some of the first taxes that an American government had made on directly on the people. There was actually kind of a divide between John Adams and Alexander Hamilton. Eventually, Alexander Hamilton and his supporters completely rejected John Adams and his presidency. Unfortunately, it was this division within the Federalists that caused their downfall, because it was at a time when they needed to have unity the most that they didn't have it. And in response, Thomas Jefferson was able to win the election of 1800 because he won the support of the South and the West. In the election of 1800, the Federalists waged a defensive war, calling for strong central government and good order. And the Democratic-Republican victory in New York and the divided vote in Pennsylvania threw the election to Jefferson. The combination of the South and these crucial middle states would keep the Democratic-Republicans in control of the federal government for the next generation. The big accomplishment of this time period, though, was the transfer of power from one person to another without violence or without social unrest. And this is the genius of this system that they created, and the character of the men who were helping out with this. So the transfer of power demonstrated that governments elected by the people could be changed in an orderly way, even in times when there was a lot of conflict between political parties. In his inaugural address of 1801, Jefferson praised this achievement by declaring, "We are all Republicans and we are all Federalists." The rise of political parties actually greatly increased the amount of popular participation in government, and the American politics became much more competitive and democratic. Popular celebrations became more common, and suffrage, or the ability to vote, also increased.